Hello, I am Anderson, and today I'll be interviewing my sister, Rowan. We're going to be going over multiple subjects we learned throughout my ethnic studies class. Some of the main concepts will be about whiteness, freedom, incarceration, and a bit about solidarity. Uh, First off, to start, Rowan can talk a little bit about what she is currently majoring in and studying at college.
Hello. I go to Chapman University and I'm currently pursuing my Bachelor's of Arts in Community Educational Studies, which practically means that I am working towards becoming an educator in non-K through 12 settings, so nonprofits, orgs, companies, businesses, and the like. And then my minor is in law and liberal arts, under track one, which is emphasis in justice, morality, and law.
All right, perfect. So the first subject I would like to cover is mostly going to be about whiteness. The first question I had was, there's an argument we've been making that white wasn't always an identity that has been around in the US, but legally and culturally was created to uphold power. An example of this, when we watched the YouTube video Whitewashed, it discusses how throughout the 17th and 19th century that there was multiple groups of white people somehow were kind of pushed away from groups such as like Italian and Polish, but over time these groups kind of became one that was seen as white. I believe that over time these different groups of different cultures and different races kind of became a setting of one where it was white, black, Latinx, instead of describing them more towards their country, as it was easier then to make laws around it, such as defining a group as white and defining a group as non-white, had ramifications such as when we discuss about land and what it means to have like what it means to have not ability but power in the system that we usually have. So I guess my main question would be, how has whiteness legally and culturally been able to uphold power throughout the US?
There are so many ways in which it has done that. First kind of deconstructing what you were talking about. I think that we can see, at least from our experiences as like being Jewish, Italian, and Irish, and our name being changed likely through Ellis Island. I think that there was this belief that like by having each of us together as being white, there's more power in assimilation. And so by trying to push that prescribed notion onto other cultures, by putting them on the outs, definitely made the differences between like the Polish and the Irish and the Italians not as necessary, because as long as white was in power, they didn't care what type of white you were. And I think that we definitely see it with almost like the whistleblower mentality that historically white women have been known to take on. We see it as like, are you familiar with that? Like,
No.
that statement? So with white women, it's like they have been the worst friend, I guess, to any other minority group, because though white men were getting power before white women, they didn't want anybody else to be getting power before them. And so it was like, if that meant black men were getting the ability to vote, okay, I'm going to accuse them of raping me because they're going to believe me because I'm a white woman. So they would whistle blow. And I think that it was like whiteness has always been used as a weapon to ensure that like if you're not on the in, you're on the out.
Yeah. I think over time, being able to kind of not separate people throughout different European groups and put it just into one of being white, it let people exclude others. I mean, there's been posters where you see of people in the US used to not want people who were considered like, there's supposed to have like dirty foreigners, whereas people coming from Italy had them as like the mafia. Just being able to kind of group these people together, where then it kind of let them be more accepting of them. and it kind of just gave white as a group more power. And through policies, I mean, even talking about stuff like the crack epidemic, which happened pretty recently within the last 40 years, and still the consequences are ongoing throughout like the prison system. You can see the laws were made kind of towards to not punish white people while punishing other groups.
Right.
And then I guess the next question I had is that in one of the essays we were reading throughout our class, we talked about how freedom means like collective liberation. And today, kind of a lot of people see freedom as like an individual, right? Where they kind of think about more for themselves, kind of like property and choice of like, oh, my body, my choice, or my home, I should be able to protect my home how I want. How do you think that freedom has changed over time, and what would you consider freedom now?
Well, if we think about freedom over time, we can like think back to like Locke and Rousseau and Marx and the like question of, is freedom the lack of sovereignty? Is freedom like the actual physical independence from, or is it more a state of being or mentality? Um, it's definitely shifted over time, especially when it was like, at least when we were making, or when the Constitution was being drafted, and it was like the Bill of Rights, when we're talking about like being able to, you don't have the decision to like house, or do you have a decision to house the people who were fighting for your freedom? You house them in your home. Whereas like we wouldn't really want random strangers in our homes now. Like we didn't have freedom like in that sense. And now I think it's a very big political thing. Whereas before, freedom, oh, like I don't know if it was as right or left. Whereas now I think that whenever we're talking about like the notions of my body, my choice, we definitely have that connotation with the more liberal side, as in like definitely with talks of abortion. But then, yeah, it got turned around during COVID when somehow that became more political, and we saw the right side um, using it to talk about anti-vaccination and having the ability to choose then. And so I think that once again, it's been weaponized to, like, instead of actually believing in freedom, trying to use it to prove another group as, like, wrong in their beliefs. But we also see the question of, like, okay, so, like you're saying, if we're going to say, okay, freedom for my body, my choice, what makes it different from freedom to bear arms? Like that is an interesting divide, I think, where once again we see it definitely being labeled or categorized between the two groupings, whereas I don't know if freedom was so radical, or maybe not radical, but so one side or the other. And I think we, like, it's such a hard question to answer. I took a whole course in political and legal freedom, or it was more political and legal philosophy, and that's where we talked about John Locke and Rousseau and all the philosophers, and it was like they all have different understandings of what is freedom. And I think it is an individual experience. And I think freedom nowadays is still different for each person. I think that's the one thing that's stayed the same over time.
I just bring it back to our class. Something that we read was "What Does Freedom Mean Now?" which kind of talks about how freedom between like marginalized groups and people who like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X advocated for kind of a collective liberation of not just wanting freedom for themselves, but for a group of people.
Right.
So I think there is some modern ideas that still kind of have that, where we do see less boycotts and less people kind of fighting for freedom on a large scale, and more people kind of fighting for freedom for themselves, even if it is for a group, like you're saying, my body, my choice. I kind of agree. I think freedom is personal, but there also is freedom kind of between like healthcare, housing, politics, where you're going to have a voice where your idea of freedom doesn't just affect you, it also affects a group, even if it isn't necessarily about just race or just gender.
What I meant by freedom being individual is less on freedom of rights or equality of rights, more of the feeling of freedom. I think that each person would have a different, like, they would need to have certain boxes checked in order to feel free. And that's not going to look the same to everyone.
Yeah.
But I definitely agree that, like, I don't know, there's this belief that because people can vote and go to school and whatnot, that we have equality.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that every grouping's equality and therefore freedom actually looks the same. I don't think we're there.
Yeah, I agree. And then on to my next question. We talked about how prison abolition in the U.S. Is tied to a lot of the issues of people being incarcerated is tied to poverty, mental health, and racial bias, not just actual crime control. We kind of also talked about how usually when someone says prison abolition, you kind of think of like the purge, you think of, or a lot of people think of the purge or just letting prisons go to waste, having, just crime running free. But we discussed how that's not necessarily how it is. In the article, What is Prison Abolition? It argues that a 700% increase in state prison population since the 1970s kind of reflect more of a political choice of not necessarily that people are becoming more like evil or they're committing more crimes, but that the actual policies that we're making kind of criminalize homelessness, addiction, and poverty. So I would say it's more of that there's an actual struggle that people are having than crime rates are like skyrocketing up. So why do you think that is kind of like, what do you think of when someone says prison abolition? What do you kind of think of in your head?
Well, I guess once again, I'll like pigeon walk back to like what you were just mentioning. I think people are kind of unaware of the history behind like why so many people are in prison. I think talking about um, poverty and race and ability, mental or physical, we definitely saw with the like mental health institutes being like dispersed or um, dissolved. I think it was in the 70s when we saw that spike. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
A lot of the people who would have just benefited from, especially people who had like developmental and intellectual disabilities, who used to be housed in those facilities, just being swept into the system. And we see a much larger scale of people with disabilities in the system compared to the percentage in just the population. Same thing with people who have who are on like social security for their disabilities, and we also see the same thing with people of color. There are way more black people in prison than there are black people in our population, like that percentage wise. And so I think that we would be obtuse to say that those people are just actually doing more crime.
Yeah.
I don't think that they are. I think that it's very likely and obvious that they are targeted. People are criminalized for sleeping on the street. We see like that all the time. We see the architecture now with our benches and our bus stops, making it so that it's harder and harder for the houseless community to find comfortable spots to spend the night. And a lot of times we see people who are like struggling financially going to prison because it's the only way they can guarantee a place to stay or food or even medication that they need. But we see mistreatment within the prisons, and like when I think of about like the abolition of it, I think it's more of the deconstruction of what is its actual purpose and is it being used that way, because currently I don't think it's actually fulfilling what it needs to be doing. In a lot of ways, it's overreaching and bringing in minorities who would benefit much more from other types of rehabilitation or facilitations for them rather than solitary confinement because we don't know what to do with them.
I think that our criminal justice system kind of swings like a pendulum between punishment and like rehabilitation,
Mhm.
where it kind of over time from policies to policies it changes.
Right.
We talked a little bit in our class kind of how what you're saying that there's not necessarily the services or resources for some people to get out of these scenarios. We
Right.
listened to the song "For Your Eyes Only" by J. Cole,
Okay.
and in it he talks about how it's a story from his friend's perspective of being trapped in a cycle of he has no way out of the crime system, that he feels like
Right.
he has to rob or steal to meet ends meet for his daughter. Now he's not just like supplying for himself, but for other people. And we
Mhm.
see this throughout multiple forms of art through like something like rap or drawings or people who do poetry,
Mhm.
where it's this idea that these people don't, it's not that it's a culture or a person issue, the sense of that there is no way to get out of it. There is no way person to turn to help. I mean, when you listen to a lot of songs like Walking by Denzel Curry or like that J. Cole song I just mentioned, there is definitely an issue of the system isn't built fairly for everyone. It's not
Mhm.
that everyone has the same, like just like we're talking about freedom, not everyone has the same freedom, that some people are stuck in a scenario where they can't get out. And when we make these policies that aren't there to rehabilitate people and aren't meant to kind of bring everyone into a functioning state society, but more to punish people who go against what we see as like taboos or sanctions, there is going to be a rise in like the prison system. So I think
Mhm.
abolishing it in the sense of, hey, we can take off some of the extra money that we're using for police officers and use it for homeless shelters, is using it for finding ways to get people off of drugs or how to get people clean from drugs,
Mhm.
would be more helpful than just criminalizing and like arresting people.
Well, I think also like the way our system works right now is so like when we're talking about it like financially like, with like abolishing it
Yeah,
or with deconstructing it, it's very capitalistic.
like slave
Where
wages and
the slave wages, and then also even within like being a victim, when we see most cases don't go to like court, but the
yeah,
ones that do, a lot of times it's like state versus da da da.
yeah,
And so in those situations, you it's not the defendant and plaintiff being the perpetrator and the victim or the victim's family. They
hmm,
see the victim as the state. And so you are paying your dues to the state.
yeah,
And so in that sense, it's like even the way the system is built at the very front end, before you even made it into the prison system, like it's not about them being better or them somehow making the life of those that they've hurt or harmed better. It's about like making the state look good. It's about like the state winning or the town or the United States. And I think even with just like the system, we talk about the school to prison pipeline all the time, but even within the like prison system, the pipeline is so cyclical because they don't give you any like they send you out
mhm,
oftentimes with like nothing.
yeah,
Like even if you were doing better, you a lot of times people get jobs in prison, um, not paid fairly, but sometimes it's like they're working in the library or whatever the case may be, and maybe they're finding purpose there, and then they're sent out without their family being contacted, without
hmm.
like any like way to get a job, and then
Now you
no
also have like a
wonder
felony charge.
no wonder they're gonna come back,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. I think we talked a little bit about in our class about how the system is built on you kind of needing like the prison system needs people to be working in it. It's not just
Right.
that, oh, we're there to kind of rehabilitate people. It is a system to like make money, and that these people have to, the prisoners have to work there
Right.
for what they're getting paid, like anywhere between like 20 cents to 80 cents like a day or an hour, which
Yeah.
isn't fair. And I guess going on to the next question, which kind of still ties into it. When we hear the phrase new Jim Crow,
Mm-hmm.
it suggests that mass incarceration is a modern version of segregation laws. What connection do you see between slavery, Jim Crow, and today's prison? And then some context behind that is the so that we kind of read a little bit about was Michelle Alexander's concept of new Jim Crow, which talks about how it functions more as like a racial caste system where it kind of funnels people into like almost legalized slavery, where it's not necessarily segregation in a way of like, okay, we're separating these people, but is still a new Jim Crow in the way that it's kind of not forcing, but it's guiding people to the result that we're seeing, where more people are kind of ending in these prisons, and there's not as many like tools or ways to get like these people out of systems.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I think it is familiar, or like in I guess similar to Jim Crow in the way that the system is when you enter it. We see, especially in male prisons, way less than female prisons, or like men's and women's prisons. We see much more like gangs for protection, and then there is that sense of segregation where it is my group versus your group, and a lot of times it is based on race. And we see these prejudices, biases, like really infiltrate and rise much higher outside, because survival instincts of like it's kill or get killed, and so it becomes much more racialized. And then like slaves, like viewed by the system really as full humans. It's kind of like that, like 3/4 law,
3/5.
3/5 law, where their vote would be counted less. It's very reminiscent to that,
Well,
in my opinion.
It wasn't that like their votes would be counted less. It was that they couldn't vote.
Yeah.
That their amount of people would be counted as 3/5, so then they'd have more power. Like white people have more power. But yeah, I get what you're
saying. Which, like, in essence, their vote would count
exactly.
Less. And so it feels very similar to that, where like these people are not treated as such, and that is very similar to how Jim Crow times were, for my readings.
And then for the next question, there's definitely a separation between personal racism, like individual bias people have, versus systemic racism. Talking about how there's gender segregation, it's gone now, the segregation from like a political stance, but something like de facto segregation between person to person, how someone sees someone of a different race is an ongoing kind of challenge. I mean, someone like Martin Luther King realized that he wasn't happy with just kind of what he's done at a political level, but wanted to work more towards fixing kind of how society viewed each other before he was assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
So something we kind of talked about was that throughout the whitewashed interviews, we notice how people kind of like, when we're looking at statistics of how different people feel badly for other people who've been hurt, kind of like who they relate to more, every race felt a sharp connection towards white people than any other race.
Interesting.
So I think there definitely is a personal racism, and even though there is less systemic racism, there's still systemic racism that is kind of built into the books and definitely budgets of how things are managed. There's definitely still like prejudice between not just like at a political level, but from people to people, which you can't get rid of that. So I think that does then not just trickle into the political level. So even if there's not policies that are straight up having segregation, it still affects people when you're talking about budgets and you're talking about kind of these laws that people have a say in. So I guess my question would then be, how do you explain the difference between like systemic racism and individual racism?
Well, I think systemic is when we see like it's built into the system, obviously. Yeah. Like that's what, whenever we talk about cops, for example, like ACAB, I think it got misconstrued a lot of times where people took it as like these individual people who are sacrificing themselves for your protection, your calling, like they work for a system that, whether they started that way or not, is like has that feedback loop of black is dangerous, difference is dangerous, and it's that concept of culture as difference, culture as disability, culture as, where the minute people are scared of something, it's my belief that a lot of the times we act out of fear, and fear gets turned into anger, and that's why we see um, Black people and um, intellectually and developmentally disabled people being shot and assaulted by police officers much more than we see white able-bodied people, because that's what the system has taught them. Whereas with individual beliefs, I think it's really interesting. When I was like doing some research in high school, so the research may be different now. I found out that prejudice is formed at the age of 3 or 4, and so by not being exposed to things, you form like those prejudices later in life, based on those formation times. And so that's why individual prejudice and bias and racism is from the systems, because if we don't see that representation in our TV, in our classrooms, in our friends, of like not even just talking about the prison system, but like let's talk about same-sex couples in kids' TV shows. Like we see parents in TV shows all the time, but they're typically heteronormative, where they have that nuclear family where it's like, if we just had two parents who weren't in a straight relationship, like that right there would be helping not form that prejudice of homophobia later on in life. Yeah. Same thing with showing Black people in TV shows being kind, or just like having friends who are from different classes or different religions or whatever status it may be around your children. Like that is when the individual racism and such is formed, whereas the system is like putting that on through whatever it's feeding us. So I don't think you can have one without the other typically. I think because the system is a system, it's already so ingrained that it's feeding that out.
Yeah. I know they did a study where they had a bunch of white and a bunch of Black kids, and they gave them the option of different colored dolls, some white, some Black, and all of them, including the Black kids, chose the white doll.
Right.
And I think you're right with there needs to be more representation. I mean, when I think of something like Sesame Street, I know they added a couple of years ago a character that has, I think it was autism or some form of mental disability, where I think things like that, which are a public station or a way for kids to be able to not just learn and not kind of accept, but actually integrate those things into society, seeing it as, oh, this isn't something that's different, but normative. It's normative, that there isn't a sense of kind of ostracizing or alienating someone because they feel different than you. It becomes
like, even if you're integrating it, but like it's more on the side where it's like we're talking about it very explicitly and using this as a learning model, it's different because then you're once again making it culture as difference, where it's us versus them. Whereas if it's everybody together, like, oh yeah, we're gonna go over to Mrs. and Mrs. house with your kid, like it doesn't have to be something different. It's not like, well, let's sit down and talk about what a lesbian is before we go over. Like, it just should be part of.
Okay, so going to the next question, talk about kind of how to reform some of the issues we have. A kind of like a roadmap that I thought of initially was to stop building prisons probably as actively as we're doing. I think that would probably be one of the first steps, kind of building a system where it's not just like, okay, make a new prison, put people in it, kind of slowing that down. I think also working to reduce the current population of people in prisons. I mean, we talked about how this system wasn't built for how many people are in prison. There was this one case where we learned about how this one guy, someone stole, I think, a wallet or a purse from someone, and then they got this other guy because he looked similar, I guess, enough to them. And he was in prison for, I think it was 1,000 days, and his cousin had something similar happen to him, and he just pleaded guilty because he didn't even do it, but he felt like he needed to. He decided not to, and then after 2, 3, 4 years, he was proven innocent 'cause he didn't do it. So I guess a situation where our current system isn't built for how many people we are putting in prison, and I think us trying to force these people or having all these laws that put people in prison isn't working. So I think kind of one of the most urgent things we should do to slow down prisons is like kind of slow construction or slow the budget and shift kind of the idea from what you're talking about with punishment to more rehabilitation. I mean, we make up the U.S. Makes up 20% of every single person that's in prison in the world. There's like 2.2 million people in prison. So I think kind of instead of keeping these people in prison because it is a system that makes them money, instead of doing that and kind of focusing more on how can we get these people to be back into society and get jobs and not need to go back into the system, like I think it's called like recidivism, where people feel kind of like they need to go back into the system. So I think to me that's kind of one way that we could kind of stop the increase of numbers from people in prison. So how do you think is like a way that we could kind of slow down having all these people go into prisons and keeping them in prisons for so long?
My fear with like the suggestion you have is the people running the prisons. Like a lot of times, even if they go in wanting to help rehabilitate, wind up having bad experiences and they no longer care about it. And so I think if you cut the budgets and slowed it down, we would just have more people jammed into the same spot with even less care for them. So I think before we could stop building the prisons and funding the prisons is like you would have to get systems in place first. To feed off of what you were saying, like I agree. We shouldn't have as many people in prison. I think a lot of them don't need to be in prison. I think also right now the way it's being used to coax plea bargains is adding to that number. I know in there's a movie called Just Mercy, which is based off a true case, and there was a man who was put on death row right next to the electrocution chair so that he could hear people getting like electrocuted. And this was before he even went to court or anything because they wanted him to plead guilty, or they wanted him to what they wanted him to do was be the person who pointed out someone else for a different case. And so they're like, either you will, knowing that he had a fear of electrocution and fire and like burning because he had a past with it, they put him next to it to scare him into that. And so he wound up giving this like plea bargain deal where he was like, yep, this guy murdered this woman. I was there, I saw it. And he wasn't. And they coaxed it out of him by putting him there. And so right now it's being used to threaten people too. Like obviously that's one case, but I'm sure it's not an isolated incident. And so it's like we need to be much more on top of the way we're managing and actually putting people into prisons. Before they've been convicted of anything, why are they spending time in solitary confinement? That's what we're seeing with people who have intellectual and developmental disabilities too. We see them being placed in solitary confinement, which is it's a very harmful like path, but it's extra damaging for people with IDDs. And so it's like the way we are using it to punish certain groups. I'm not saying that prison should never be punishment. I think that in certain cases, like, okay, you did something bad and it should be a punishment. But there are a lot of people there that don't deserve to be punished, especially the way that the prison system is punishing them. So I think it's more we need to fix the system before we can, or have ulterior routes before completely dismantling it. Because I don't think that they're going to work from the inside out, they need to have places to first put those people before they're going to make any changes within the system.
What like systems or kind of like ways do you think that could like be implemented where we could make communities more safe or kind of stop as much crime?
Education.
So you think being able to inform people or have people have options where they don't need to kind of go towards crime, do you think that would end it?
Mm-hmm. I think by letting people believe that they can be successful and be prepared and feel capable eliminates a lot of fear that leads towards crime. I think that by educating people on the possibilities and their own capabilities helps boost communities. And I think we see less crime in areas that have better education systems that actually care about their students, not just about the financial turnaround. It doesn't mean that everyone needs to get a graduate or like a degree in college. Maybe trade school is great, or just even graduating high school is perfectly fine. Just somewhere where they feel heard, feel like smart, knowledgeable, and feel like, you know what, I can turn around this knowledge that I have to use it in a job.
Yeah.
Just telling people that they are like worth it. I think having that already implemented to this like would be really beneficial.
We kind of talked a little bit about resistance and kind of what are ways that people can become more informed. And I guess a question that I had on kind of being able to inform people on like race and incarceration is what is an example of something that maybe you've seen or something you've attended through campus or your own free time where it kind of stood out to you that like, oh, I'm glad like this is either happening or you think like it would be a good thing that maybe should be implemented elsewhere. Like I know at our school, we often have fairs or we have kind of like club like meetup things where when you walk around campus, you see people from different religions, people from different groups that are willing to go up to you and talk to you about these things to make it so you have kind of like a second home, or for some people like a first home where you have a group of people that is willing to listen to you and being able to have classes. I think being able to have funding at a government level for classes or for students to be able to express themselves and to be able to learn about these things are important. So what's like a way that you think would be good to spread like awareness about these issues?
Well, like speaking from the experiences that I've had at Chapman, I think some things that they do well are we have the Fish Interfaith Center, which supports any and all religions. So if you don't see your religion being represented, if you tell them, they will bring in either like, let's say you are Jewish and you want like a rabbi, and let's say that's not already being offered, they will make sure to bring one in, so that anybody, regardless, will have representation there. And I think that's a really unique experience. They even have things like meditation rooms if you're not religious. And then we also have a cross-cultural center of the CCC, and that is open for students for many different reasons, and they can use it how they'd like. And I know a lot of students will just go up there and hang out because they know that's where they're going to see people who look and have experiences like them in that space. And I think that's really cool. One thing that is really interesting right now is Chapman's under fire for being anti-Semitic, because we have had pro-Palestine like marches and I guess encampments because of everything that's going on currently. And right now our DEI system is kind of shifting a lot. Like the DEI chair left. Some believe he was removed. We all found out through like a leaked email before any of the faculty did. Our president is stepping down and he's like refusing to comment. Students who were marching using megaphones are getting in trouble. Like, it's really interesting, and I think right now the student body is kind of shooting shots at the faculty, And in a lot of ways I understand, and I'm very hurt along with my peers, especially because we're seeing things like research funding being pulled after students are working on it for all this time. And it's hard because we're a private institute, and so we were under this false belief that even though the administration was going to be attacking these parts of like specifically DEI, that we wouldn't be as impacted. But due to government funding, it's like if we don't follow what is being enforced, we'll lose that funding and students will lose their scholarship. So it's like, do we want students not to be able to attend, or do we want to be able to speak our minds? Both.
Yeah.
But it's hard, and it's like in educational atmospheres, you want to be able to create those spaces for students. I think we can only do that though when the people who are funding it allow such. It's the same thing with nonprofits. Like a lot of times the grants that people get or the loans people get come with a clause of this has to be used a certain way. And if you don't use it how they want you to, you get that funding pulled. And so less of like how to create those spaces, more of just like being aware of the fact that like sometimes the places that you're looking for those spaces in, they want to create that for you, but they just financially can't afford the burden of getting that funding pulled. So it's like you would like to trust the systems to enforce that for you, but being able to provide that for yourself and creating those communities within just the people, I think is the safest way, because otherwise it can get pulled out from under you.
I think we talked a bit about in our class of like allyship versus solidarity. I think things like posting on TikTok or Instagram are good because it brings awareness. But I think like what you're saying, that there has to be, kind of how you talk about a space for people, or you need people to be able to have work in a group. You need some funding a lot of times. You can't just have it where, oh, okay guys, let's all, post something on Instagram, which does spread awareness.
Yeah.
But it's not really going to do anything. You need to be able to have a foundation. You need to be able to, if you take away kind of the grassroots of allowing people to voice their mind, then it's kind of impossible for people in these like institutions to be able to do these things. I mean, you're not going to have teachers, or kind of when you're talking about I don't remember the exact name of that center you're talking about, where people who, if they don't have a religion, can go and find like what you're talking about, like a rabbi or someone that can connect with their religion. I think you need things like that, which can then bring people closer to kind of feeling like togetherness.
And the hard part is like the reason why we're able to do that is because we're a private school with such a high tuition, and they financially can do that, but other places can't.
Yeah.
And it's just like unreasonable to believe that every place can afford that, which they unfortunately can't.
I guess something else I'd want to kind of bring up as a question is when you were talking to like maybe people who don't see it as like super important or value, maybe if it's like friends, family, teachers, or people who kind of are on the side of maybe like, oh, we shouldn't put all this funding toward it, or prisons, how they are right now, are a necessity, or people who say like, oh, I'm not racist, I just think these things. What are some ways that, from a person-to-person perspective, not necessarily that like you need to rewire or change this person, but let's say like kind of a way you can, in a nice and kind of like a reflective way, be able to talk to people who don't see kind of the value in being able to have like these areas to go, or be able to have education on these topics. Like what's a way that it's kind of able to talk to these people about that?
I think narratives move people the most, and they stick with people the most. And I think with statistics and facts, a lot of times it's like people drown that out. They like don't want to hear it. Whereas the minute you start talking about a person's real story, I think that even if they're gonna leave not agreeing with you, it's like empathetically they can't deny what that person has experienced, and hopefully it means that the next time they encounter something, they are a little more open. And I think at the end of the day, it's like, do your best to spread that knowledge to those who are willing, rather than spending your time trying to change the minds of those who simply won't, help uplift those who need the uplifting, and like bring together those communities and help share the information to those who are open to hearing it. And like really, like, rather than trying to change someone else, just do what you can with what you have and build it up from there. And it's hard to like, because I think otherwise it gets so discouraging hearing no all the time. And I think that like if you're willing and able to like have those conversations with people, like do it when you're like in a position where you feel like you can accurately represent. But I think that sometimes it unfortunately is a waste of time, and I think you could be benefiting someone else with that time and that energy rather than going through the same motion over and over again. Some people are willing to listen. I think definitely like don't raise your voice. Try to make it like a civil conversation. But I think that people get aggressive, and I understand why. It's very emotional. And I don't like look down upon anyone who gets emotional about topics like this. But I think like unless that person is an authoritative figure who actually gets to make decisions for that community, if they're just another bystander, don't waste your time with them. Go have a conversation with someone who maybe they have the same opinions, but they're going to make a difference. Like do what's going to better the communities rather than someone who actually doesn't care.
I think like the term of speaking to the choir, like singing to the choir, whatever it is, I think there is you don't need to always talk to people who just agree with you in a sense of like, telling someone, I think this is, if they're going to agree with you, they're already kind of vote or kind of make action and agency in that way. But at the same time, what you're saying, some people just, it doesn't matter what statistics you show them, what personal story, it's almost like speaking to like a wall, to the opposite. So I think there needs to be knowing your audience, knowing that, okay, really not every conversation you're going to have with someone is going to be a home run where they're going to change their mind. And there is people who, which I think is another issue, that some people aren't going to be able to change their mind. They kind of have their decision made up, and it doesn't matter what they learn. They'll either in their head just think it's false or think it's fake, which I think is the whole other kind of conversation of like why that is. And then I guess my
which I think, to be fair though, we all have those things. Like no matter how open-minded we all say we are, like at the end of the day I'm like, yeah, I'm open-minded, but you're not going to convince me that like a whole race is bad or that a sexuality is bad, or like there are certain things where it's like we are like not going to change. And it's like,
I think the main difference is that for, at least for me, a lot of times when I have an opinion, if someone can either bring like really strong evidence, I might not necessarily say like, I'm going to change completely how I think about this, but kind of like understand, okay, maybe I don't know everything, where I think for me, I'm for like statistics are super huge. So if someone says something and they don't have just like one statistical like evidence to kind of back it, but multiple scenarios, I might kind of wonder like, maybe I should read into this more. Maybe it's something where if I thought I can only think this way, maybe I still will think that way, but be able to kind of find some leniency and find kind of like, some fluctuation between, sometimes I believe this and sometimes I believe what they're saying, not just think like people who are just left or just right. I think there's multiple policies on both sides where some people could see eye to eye with them, but they don't want to align with that side.
Right. I think that's a big issue with kind of like what we were talking about earlier, like the political like space we're in right now where a lot of people feel like they can only agree with one or the other. Because of the two-party system that we like just keep feeding into. And I think if there was a way to like somehow dissolve that or vote without knowing which party your person, just more the policies and the actual beliefs that they had, I think there would be a less of a divide.
Yeah. And then my final question was going to be, after discussing a bit about whiteness, prisons, collective freedom, and solidarity. Has your opinion on freedom or kind of freedom for yourself and freedom society, what do you kind of think about it now? Not necessarily like, it changed, but how do you kind of view freedom for yourself and freedom for your society? I'd say to start off, I guess for me, uh, I think there is two different sides to freedom. I think there's people need to have freedom to thrive in their own environment. It's not just that you can believe something, but if you don't have the means, I think it's called strain theory, where you can think whatever you want to think and you can be whoever you want to be, but if you don't have the means to fulfill those actions or be able to kind of go out and do the things you want to do, how much freedom do you really have? So it does start at a level of, yeah, you can wake up every morning and maybe do A, B, C, but if that's not, you don't really have the groundwork to be able to do things you want to do and be able to speak your mind, you're never really going to get anywhere. So I think they kind of tie into each other where freedom for everyone kind of should not bring in like their background or bring in what they look like, or if you have a felony charge. I think there is, of course, times where you have to look at, okay, if someone's a repeating offender at something, but I think everyone should be able to enjoy the same supports at a fundamental level when you're like starting as a person. I think there should be some basic needs maybe met where maybe Medicare or food. I think like the U.S. is, I don't want to give a wrong statistic, but I think it's like out of basically every first world country, the U.S. is the only one without free healthcare. Things where there is, of course, going to be differences in like socioeconomic status with occupations and with where people live, but being able to kind of make it so there's at least a starting ground where everyone has the opportunity to kind of push themselves into what they want to do. To me, that is kind of freedom. So what would you describe freedom as for you?
Well, I was planning on answering the first portion of the question, and then you can cut that out. Well, wait, well, what's freedom to me? Like how I experience freedom,
Or just
or
like
like how
what's
do I
your,
see freedom for others?
how do you see freedom for like yourself and for others? Like what do you think freedom, how do you feel like you could be free, or how do you feel that
Well,
other
when I
people
think
need
of
to
freedom, I
freedom?
think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it's that idea of like strain theory. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, have you heard of it before?
No.
It's that it's a triangle, okay, and at the base is like food, shelter,
Oh, I
water,
have
whatever,
seen
and it
that.
keeps going up
Yeah, I
until
have
you
seen
have
that.
like self-actualization. So by having all of your actual needs met, like you were saying, you're able to do the things that you want to do. And we were talking about it with our, like my Davis was home and he was like really into buying lottery tickets. He was all the things he would do different with his life if he won the lottery. Like let's say financially he didn't have to rely on work anymore. All the things he'd be doing differently. And I was saying like I think I would do exactly what I'm doing. And so in that way I have a large privilege of like financially being where I am currently as is, but also the freedom to study what I want to study and like feel comfortable to pursue the dreams that I have. Like this is what I want to be doing. And so in a certain way, like that to me, it looks like freedom. And by like trying to utilize, and capitalize on my ability to have as much freedom as I do. And also just like being aware that the level of freedom I have is not the same level of freedom that everybody else has. I don't know. I think that there needs to be a level of like understanding for other people. I don't think that we're ever all gonna be free. Like I don't, and I don't think that I'm completely free. Like there are definitely things that I prescribe to that I wouldn't necessarily if I was free, you know. And like one reason why I like to learn about all this stuff is like there's never going to be one whole answer or full understanding of any of the concepts of whiteness or even the system or like solidarity, allyship, any of that stuff, racism. Like there's always going to be more to learn about it, and it's always going to be evolving. And there's never going to be like no one's going to have a full understanding of it because everyone has a different experience.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about race and gender, they're fluid subjects. They're things that are changing consistently of how they're viewed by people, how they're viewed by the system. So as we live now, there's always, like you were saying, new things to be learned. It's not just oh, this is what I think should happen, and that's always going to work. I mean,
Right.
we've seen so many different forms of government, so many different kind of ideas of how things should be run, and it's like always changing. It's always like hopefully evolving. I think the system we have right now has proved to work in some ways, but also proved to not work in a lot of ways,
Right.
with our prison system especially. And I think there needs to be some change. I mean, when there's some issues that we're facing in the U.S. where we kind of pride ourselves on being number one at everything, and we see that there's so many different factors that other countries are doing better than us,
Right.
being able to understand, like, hey, maybe the two-party system doesn't work the best. Maybe having the idea of like a completely free market doesn't work perfectly, where maybe there should be more restrictions. Or I think freedom has to kind of come from your government in a sense of that you're going to live in a system no matter what.
Right.
At this point, it's not like just like anarchy.
And I think systems are necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, I mean, we have systems, they are necessary. It brings people kind of to not be doing these bad things. It brings us to be able to kind of evolve as a group,
Mm-hmm.
and hopefully have people's living get better and better.
Yeah.
So I think,
But systems don't need to be stationary. Like, they need to
yeah,
evolve. If they're staying the same due to ego or any other reason, like, maybe reevaluate. Like, things should be shifting because everything else around it is.
yeah, freedom's, I think it's ever changing
Right.
of what is freedom, what is happening currently in the world, and what is like seen as freedom from person to person is going to change kind of based on your background. So when we talk about kind of whiteness, of course we're going to have a different sense of freedom as we are born with like, I don't know like the exact word for it, but like we're kind of born ahead, not necessarily in like every subject of
We're
like
born within privilege.
within privilege. There we go. Where we might not be extremely rich, but we're also like there's a certain amount of laws and policies that are kind of built around you. So I think being able to have it where everyone has an equal sense of kind of that freedom, and not having to worry about certain things is kind of like a step in the right direction. So the policies and also dealing with these subjects that are changing and kind of making it so it's more equity based for everyone.
Well, I think that, like, we're hearing so much about things aren't equal and things aren't working, and it's like it's not coming from nowhere.
Yeah.
Like, put your ego aside, like you were saying with like America thinks that we're the best in every way. When you admit that you're not, that's when you become better. Like,
Yeah.
listen to what the people are saying and actually make a change.
Yeah. I think you have to listen to what people are saying. I think that is all though. Thank you very much for letting me interview you. You brought up like a bunch of points that I wouldn't have thought up, and being able to have talk of your experiences at Chapman, where it's going to be a very different community than at a community college, also helps me kind of, see a different side where I don't have anyone that's like, has talked to me about these things before. So thank you for letting me interview you.